From her earliest days in the leafy enclaves of suburban New York to the most scrutinized spheres of Washington power, Joan Bennett Kennedy lived a life that reflected both the glimmering privilege and profound turbulence so famously associated with America's royal family, the Kennedys. Born Virginia Joan Bennett on September 2, 1936, she eventually dropped Virginia and was widely known simply as Joan. She grew up in a comfortable Catholic household that prized discipline, education, and decorum. Her father, Harry Wiggin Bennett Jr., was a successful real estate and building materials executive, and her mother, Virginia Stead Bennett, worked as a nurse before devoting herself to raising Joan and her siblings. Even as a little girl, Joan exuded a mixture of shy warmth and innate poise, traits that would later come to define her presence within America's most famous political clan. Yet beneath the composure, she harbored vulnerabilities that would shape her journey in ways she could never have anticipated. Joan's childhood was marked by academic diligence and a deep love of music. She studied piano from an early age, displaying a precocious sensitivity to tone, technique, and expressive phrasing. Music, to her, offered both a challenge and a refuge, a place to retreat from the world's demands, particularly once she grew into adolescence and felt the expectations placed upon a well-brought-up young woman in mid-century America. She attended Manhattanville College in Purchase, New York, an institution run by the Religious of the Sacred Heart that emphasized both intellectual rigor and charitable values. Her experiences there reinforced her inclination toward understated elegance and a life of service. It was during this period, while Joan was still an undergraduate, that she first encountered Edward Ted Moore Kennedy at a party hosted by mutual friends. Ted was the youngest son of Joseph and Rose Kennedy, American political royalty, who had already witnessed triumph and tragedy in nearly equal measure. By the time Joan and Ted met, the Kennedys had weathered the shocking wartime death of eldest son Joseph Jr., and were in the midst of witnessing the meteoric political ascent of John F. Kennedy. Ted himself had a broad, engaging smile, a warmth with people, and an energy that could light up any room. Joan, introspective and quietly gracious, found his charm irresistible. They married on November 29, 1958, at St. Joseph's Church in Bronxville, New York. The wedding was a significant social event, attended by political luminaries, business elites, and, of course, the ever-growing Kennedy clan. Suddenly, Joan was part of a family known for its dynastic ambitions and tightly knit bonds, an environment she would later describe as both exhilarating and overwhelming. While the public saw only the swirl of glamorous parties, oceanfront compounds, and jovial family football games on the lawn in Hyannisport, Joan quickly discovered that being a Kennedy wife entailed intense pressure and constant media scrutiny. Overnight, her life was no longer her own. Yet in those early years, she approached her role with composure, standing dutifully by Ted's side as he embarked on a political career that would place him in the U.S. Senate by 1962. She gave birth to 3 children: Cara Ann, born in 1960, Edward Jr., born in 1961, and Patrick Joseph, born in 1967. Cara's arrival coincided with the dawn of the 1960s, a decade that would radically reshape American life and bring both unparalleled success and crushing tragedy to the Kennedy family. As Joan balanced motherhood with the obligations of a senator's wife, she watched her brother-in-law John F. Kennedy ascend to the presidency in 1961, an event that put the Kennedys at the center of international attention. First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy soon invited Joan to various cultural and diplomatic events at the White House, where Joan's polished demeanor and interest in the arts proved invaluable. She could speak intelligently about music and literature, delighting visiting dignitaries without ever overshadowing her more famous in-laws. Yet even as she played her part in these grand social circles, Joan longed for a sense of normalcy. She cherished quiet moments at home, reading stories to Cara, or practicing the piano after the children had gone to bed. But privacy was scarce. Photographers perched outside the family's residence, hungry for glimpses of the Kennedys' personal lives. Every gesture risked becoming fodder for the tabloids, whose coverage ranged from reverent admiration to intrusive speculation. Joan managed her anxieties with outward grace, though she later admitted to close friends that the constant scrutiny weighed heavily on her. She turned to music more than ever, finding solace in the structured beauty of classical compositions. Tragedy soon reminded everyone of the Kennedys' mortal vulnerability. In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, a national trauma that reverberated through the family with horrifying intensity. Joan's own shock was compounded by her concern for her husband, who took on additional burdens in the wake of his brother's death, and for the extended family, particularly Jackie, who was left a widow raising 2 young children in the public eye. In the immediate aftermath, Joan stepped up her role as a supportive sister-in-law, helping in ways both practical and emotional, all while caring for her own young children and coping with her own sense of grief. Through it all, she maintained a gentle, nurturing presence, though, as she later recounted, she felt increasingly lost in the swirl of mourning, ceremony, and the relentless press coverage that followed. As the nation grieved, the Kennedys regrouped. Robert F. Kennedy, another brother, stepped into the political spotlight, and Ted continued his work in the Senate, building a reputation as a champion for civil rights, health care, and social programs. Joan accompanied him on the campaign trail during his re-election bids, dutifully shaking hands at rallies and fundraisers, giving short speeches that emphasized family values and community. Publicly, she was lauded as a refined and empathetic presence, a perfect complement to Ted's robust political personality. Privately, however, the demands of campaigning, raising children, and grappling with the unpredictable rhythms of a prominent public family took their toll. In 1964, Ted survived a near-fatal plane crash that left him with a severe back injury requiring months of rehabilitation. Joan felt her world closing in, simultaneously caring for a husband in constant pain and 2 very young children, while newly pregnant with Patrick. She spent endless hours at Ted's bedside, offering what support she could, reading to him, relaying updates from the political arena, and helping manage his Senate staff's morale. The press documented her every move, heralding her devotion as proof that the Kennedys always rallied together in adversity. 1968 brought another devastating blow: Robert F. Kennedy's assassination in Los Angeles during his own presidential campaign. By then, tragedy seemed to stalk the Kennedys with near-mythic persistence. Joan again stood in the background at a national funeral, offering solace to a grieving widow, Ethel, and her children. Now, the mother of 3, Joan felt a deepening sense of fear for her own family's safety, a foreboding that the cycle of violent death might not be over. She became quieter, more guarded, relying on close confidants, some within the family, others longtime friends from her earlier life, to keep her spirits afloat. It was around this time that Joan began to struggle with alcohol. She had long been a social drinker, but the combination of unrelenting public pressure, personal grief, and her innate sensitivities made the lure of a few quiet drinks at night increasingly hard to resist. Alcohol offered a kind of temporary numbness from anxieties that never ceased, from a future that felt perpetually overshadowed by the possibility of yet another calamity. She did her best to conceal her habit, aware that a very public family scandal would devastate Ted's political image and, just as importantly, further disrupt her children's lives. In July 1969, the Chappaquiddick incident erupted into a national scandal when a car driven by Ted crashed off a bridge on Martha's Vineyard, resulting in the drowning death of a young campaign worker, Mary Jo Kopechne. For Joan, the shock was twofold. She was pregnant at the time, though she would suffer a miscarriage soon after, and found herself reeling from yet another tragedy associated with the Kennedy name. While Ted's political career hung in the balance, Joan was thrust into the public eye, standing by him as cameras clicked and reporters shouted questions. The heartbreak of losing her unborn baby only a week after the accident underscored her mounting sense that the Kennedy life exacted a terrible price. She publicly supported her husband, but her internal struggles with grief and guilt, wondering if her presence or influence could have prevented the tragedy, deepened her vulnerability to alcoholism. Throughout the 1970s, Joan tried to find pockets of stability. She continued her love of music, occasionally performing small recitals for charitable causes. Indeed, one of her personal passions became using music therapy in hospital settings, an initiative that quietly took root through her volunteer work. She believed that music could uplift people battling illness or despair, perhaps reflecting her own unspoken wish to be healed by the transcendent power of piano and song. Yet, for every forward step, there seemed to be an event or crisis that pulled her back into the labyrinth of stress. Ted's re-election campaigns, constant speculation about his future presidential aspirations, the media's relentless fascination with the Kennedy curse, and the never-ending swirl of dinners, fundraisers, and family gatherings, where she was expected to appear poised and gracious. As her drinking worsened, friends and family grew alarmed. The bright, kind woman they knew seemed increasingly anxious, and there were whispers that she might be seeking help for alcoholism behind the scenes. The Kennedys were famously protective, preferring to keep personal matters within the tight bounds of family. That posture served them well in political matters, but could prove damaging for someone in Joan's position who needed open acknowledgement and consistent treatment for her struggles. Though she made attempts at rehabilitation, checking into clinics, attending therapy sessions, the cycles of relapse persisted, fueled by the high-stress environment in which she lived. By the late 1970s, Joan and Ted's marriage was visibly strained. Rumors circulated about Ted's own extramarital affairs and the toll that took on Joan's well-being. She felt isolated, overshadowed not only by the Kennedys' storied name but also by Ted's daunting legislative ambitions and personal demons. They separated in 1978, and the divorce became final in 1982, effectively ending a union that had spanned nearly a quarter century and produced 3 children, each now grappling with the complexities of the Kennedy legacy. Despite the acrimony that sometimes flared in the press, Joan and Ted made efforts to maintain civility for the sake of their children. Kara, Ted Jr., and Patrick were stepping into adulthood, each forging their own paths while carrying the famous last name. Post-divorce, Joan faced both relief and fear. She was free from the day-to-day pressure of being Mrs. Ted Kennedy, but she was also cut off from the fortress of resources and support that accompanied the name. The media, so used to lumping her in with the rest of the family, seemed at times to lose interest, unless a new scandal cropped up. She spent much of the 1980s seeking a more independent identity. She taught music classes informally, gave occasional piano recitals for charity events, and deepened her commitment to philanthropic causes, though she did so with the same quiet style she had always favored. Her personal struggles, however, did not vanish overnight. Alcoholism is a chronic disease, and Joan battled relapses even after her divorce. There were times she found sobriety for months or years, only to stumble again when faced with a personal setback. On more than one occasion, tabloids gleefully reported on incidents such as minor car accidents or DUIs, seizing the opportunity to paint a salacious portrait of a fallen Kennedy wife. Over time, her children emerged as her main pillars of support, reversing the parent-child dynamic in quiet, compassionate ways. Ted Jr., who had lost a leg to bone cancer at age 12, inspired Joan with his resilience. He grew up to become a lawyer and advocate for disability rights. Kara, sweet-natured and bright, shared her mother's love for family gatherings, although she too faced health challenges later in life. Patrick, the youngest, pursued a career in politics, serving as a U.S. representative from Rhode Island. Her relationship with Ted evolved into a guarded but respectful friendship over the years. He continued to serve in the Senate until his death in 2009, by which point he had become a lion of American liberal politics. Joan attended family gatherings, christenings, weddings, funerals, often standing discreetly at the side or in the background, no longer in the spotlight as she once was. While they did not always see eye to eye on personal matters, they remained united in caring for their children. In public statements, Ted acknowledged that Joan had faced unfair challenges and that she was, in many ways, a woman of grace and fortitude. In 1992, Joan authored a book titled The Joy of Classical Music, reflecting her long-standing passion and providing laypeople an approachable guide to some of history's greatest composers and works. The endeavor allowed her to channel her knowledge and love of music into a public offering that carried no political baggage. She appeared on television to promote the book, giving interviews that showed her calm intelligence and a flicker of the quiet determination she had always possessed. Critics regarded the book positively, praising Joan's ability to demystify classical music in a heartfelt, personal manner. It was one of her proudest accomplishments, evidence that she could define herself by something other than her famous last name or her personal struggles. Still, life was not without further trials. In 2003, Joan was arrested for drunk driving, a reminder that the path to sobriety can be heartbreakingly uneven. Yet as she aged, she made determined strides to stabilize her health and well-being. She sought out deeper therapeutic support, managed a more consistent routine, and spent time away from the glare of the press. She moved into a Boston apartment near the Charles River, preferring a quiet, somewhat anonymous existence broken up by visits to see her children and grandchildren. Tragedy struck again in 2011 when her daughter, Kara, died of a heart attack at age 51, following her own battle with lung cancer. Joan was left devastated. She had always shared a close bond with Kara, and losing her only daughter to illness was an ache almost beyond bearing. Yet friends who comforted her during this period observed that she handled the loss with a poignant dignity. No dramatic public statements, no televised interviews, just the reserved sorrow of a mother who had outlived her child. It was a harrowing echo of what she had seen Jackie and Ethel endure in earlier decades, and once again, she found herself mourning within the larger context of the Kennedy family's unending cycle of heartbreak. With passing years, Joan grew more removed from public life, partly by choice and partly because the media's attention shifted to younger Kennedys or other high-profile families. On the rare occasions when she granted interviews, she focused on discussing music, her grandchildren, or philanthropic efforts. She remained especially devoted to mental health advocacy and programs that address alcoholism and substance abuse, quietly donating to clinics and charities that helped women struggling with similar challenges. Those close to her remarked that she seemed finally to have found a measure of the peace she had craved for so long, an existence where she could be simply Joan, not Ted's wife, or the Kennedy wife in trouble, but an individual with her own identity and her own quiet accomplishments. In the tapestry of the Kennedy family, Joan's thread is less showy than those of her more famous relatives. She did not helm major legislative achievements, become a style icon like Jackie, or transform into a philanthropic powerhouse like Eunice. Instead, she personifies a quieter form of resilience, one that withstood plane crashes, assassinations, miscarriages, divorces, addiction, and heartbreak over the loss of loved ones. She found hope in music, love in her children, and eventually a sense of self that existed beyond the gilded cage of America's foremost political dynasty. If one visits the Kennedy family's favored haunts, from the windswept lawns of Cape Cod to the tree-lined streets of Georgetown, there's little visible trace of Joan's struggles or her triumphs. Instead, her legacy lingers in the intangible, in the musical scholarships she funded, in the quiet encouragement she offered to women fighting addiction, in the family gatherings where her presence, however restrained, served as a reminder that being a Kennedy does not grant immunity from pain. Joan Bennett Kennedy's story underscores an often overlooked truth. Beneath the veneer of glamour and grandeur, the Kennedys are ultimately a family, not a myth, but real individuals with flaws, needs, heartbreaks, and moments of grace. Joan's life is a testament to how tightly joy and sorrow can be woven, especially under the unrelenting gaze of a curious public. And if there is any final takeaway, it may be this. In a dynasty haunted by a relentless cycle of triumph and tragedy, the quietest voice sometimes speaks the most universal language of all, the enduring human quest for love, belonging, and the hope of healing.